All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and get started here. It's about 3:40. If you want to go ahead and take your seats. And before we actually get back into all the speakers at the conference, I just kind of wanted to bring up Ben Johnson and Chris Johnson. And Ben is with 1040 Hope, and Chris is with ABWE Ministries. And I'm going to give them just about 2 minutes for them to speak about it. And don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, we have these book tables here, so please avail yourself to those resources before you leave today.
Thank you, sir. Yes, as he said, my name is Ben Johnson. I lead a ministry called 1040 Hope Missions. I was a missionary also in Beirut, Lebanon for 10 years, but we are all about taking the gospel to the 1040 window, which is the area that consists of North Africa, the Middle East, and Far East Asia, where there are approximately 3 billion people, 6,000 unreached groups that receive the least amount of missionaries and the least amount of funds. But we exist to change that by taking and training indigenous leaders in how to reach their Muslim neighbors in their community through church planting, supporting ministries, and sending missionaries. And we are so thankful that the Lord has used our team in the last 15 years to launch 160 Bible study groups where we walk Muslims from Genesis to the New Testament, and where they are convinced that Jesus is the sacred space, the temple, the person that is filled by God himself. He is the Son of God. And many of them are converting, and they are professing Jesus as their Lord and Savior. And we've supported many supporting ministry Bible schools, like Pastor George's brother, who leads Faith Institute in Sudan. And we've been able to send 10 missionaries to Islamic countries. And the Lord has made all of this possible because of partners who have partnered with us, supported with us, and prayed for us. And for this to continue, for this work to still continue, of what we have talked about here is what we are practicing in Muslim countries where evangelical Christianity is less than 2%. To continue that, we are still looking for 35 more partners that are willing to partner with us $100 a month so we can continue this work. And if anyone's willing to becoming a missionary, please come talk to us, because we are wanting to send more missionaries to where the least amount of missionaries and funds are sent. Thank you, and God bless.
Good afternoon. My name's Chris Johnson, and I'm from here in Kannapolis at the time. But my wife and I have had the privilege of serving with ABWE International for 33 years, almost 20 years of that in Hungary, church planting and training national leaders to plant new churches. So it was while I was in Budapest, Hungary, that I probably first had my interaction with some Muslim college students. And then later, God led me to have opportunity to go to Bosnia and minister to Muslims in Bosnia. And then later, I had the opportunity to help the churches in Bosnia minister to the Muslim migrants during the European migrant crisis. Started around 2015. So that's how God connected me with Muslim ministry after serving in Central Europe. But I serve now with Every Ethne, which is the North American division of ABWE International. And the goal of Every Ethne is to engage and equip the local church to reach all the people groups that are in North America. The USA specifically would mean 520 different identifiable people groups in the U.S. according to latest census demographic data. My wife and I are particularly focused on trying to reach people from Muslim backgrounds. What that means for us right now is that one of our main ministries is a ministry to some Muslim men in Salisbury, which is about 30 miles north of here, a group of about 24 Muslim men, mostly Afghan refugees, recent Afghan refugees. But one of our men is from Sudan, so that's where I was able to meet George about a year ago. He brought a nice Sudanese meal to our Afghan English class. So could say many things, but we want to engage and train and mobilize the church to cross cultures without crossing borders. And as we all know, in the United States, there's never been an easier time than now to engage another culture without crossing a geographical border. So God help us to reach the nations in our neighborhoods.
All right, now we're going to hear from Reverend Anthony Rogers on the Trinity in the New Testament.
These must be gifts for the speaker. I've got these. All right, how many of you were here for the first lecture I did? If you have two hands raised, you forgot everything I said. That was Olin. So I hope, I didn't look, but I hope everybody had their hand raised. Not that what I'll say, it will only be intelligible if you heard that, but it will be more intelligible, more fruitful to you. I want to look at John 8. It's hard to do this sort of thing in half an hour, so I always have to make the decision. Do I throw a bunch of stuff at you, or do I do something with you that's more focused, but then encourage you to take what you're seeing me do and then apply that? I think this is actually more fruitful in some ways, though I'd love to just rapid fire a bunch of stuff, because that one of the benefits of that sort of thing is it just shows you how much is there. You get an overwhelming sense of, hey, this is more overwhelming than I thought. But I've got 30 minutes, so I'll look with you at a section of Scripture, and one of the things that I hope will come through very clearly is the myriad ways that this text will ultimately point to the Trinity. So I'm going to start in verse 12. This is John chapter 8. Here Jesus says, I'm the light of the world. He makes this claim, and then the religious leaders object. They say that you're just one man making this claim for yourself. And by the standards of God's law, what you're saying is unconfirmed. In order to be judicially confirmed, in order for them to act upon it, you need two witnesses. So this is the point that they make. It says, the Pharisee said to him, you're bearing witness about yourself. Your testimony is not true. Jesus answered, even if I do bear witness about myself, my testimony is true. So he does speak with final authority, but he goes on to say, for I know where I came from and where I'm going. So this is grounded in where he came from and where he's going. Somehow, because of where he came from and where he's going, he can speak on his own authority. But he goes on, but you don't know where I'm from or where I'm going. You judge according to the flesh. I judge no one. That is, you kind of have to learn Greek style. Sometimes our translators are clued into this, but the idea is, I judge no one according to the flesh. Sometimes a verb or other terms are not repeated, and they're assumed. So when he says, you judge according to the flesh, and then he says, I judge no one, the point is, I don't judge merely according to appearances. You're judging based on appearances. And what's the issue contextually? It's the identity of Jesus. So what they're guilty of here is judging merely on the basis of the appearance, which is that Jesus is a human being. He's claiming to be more than that, so they think his testimony requires more than his own say-so. He goes on, you judge according to the flesh, I judge no one. Yet even if I do judge, my judgment is true, for it's not I alone who judge, but I and the Father who sent me. In your law it is written about the testimony of two people, or that the testimony of two people is true. This is a devastating verse for modalists. Those who deny the Trinity say the Father is the Son. He says, the Father is a witness. I am the one who bears witness about myself, and the Father who sent me bears witness about me. Then in verse 19, I don't see so well, they said to him, therefore, where is your Father? Jesus answered, you know neither me nor my Father. If you knew me, you would know my Father also. Now, think about that for a moment. Jesus is claiming that the nature of his relationship to the Father is such that to know him is to know the Father, and to know the Father is to know him. And if they knew the Father truly, they'd know him. If they knew the Son truly, then they'd know the Father. And if they don't know either person, then they can't possibly know the other. Now, that's not true in the case of human sons and fathers, is it? You can know a father without knowing his child. You can know a child without knowing his or her father. Jesus is saying the nature of his relationship to the Father is such that you can't possibly know either person without knowing both. It reminds me of something that is found in older Christian writings where they say things like, Calvin, for example, was famous for saying, he's not clear which is first in the order of knowledge, the knowledge of ourselves or the knowledge of God. Do we know God first or ourselves first? What's the right order here? And his point is, if you know yourself truly, then you know yourself as a creature of God, which means that you, in order to know yourself truly, you must also, by virtue of that, know something truly about God. Otherwise, you don't know yourself truly. Unless you know yourself to be a creature of God, then you don't have true self-knowledge. You don't really know who you are. And the same is true vice versa. If you know God truly as creator, then you know yourself to be his creature. So this knowledge is reciprocal. You have to hold both of these to have the full truth. Well, same thing is true, Jesus is saying, of himself and the Father. To know me is to know the Father. To know the Father is to know the Son. And isn't that what John himself tells us in his first epistle? Nobody has the Father without the Son. Right? And Jesus himself said this, even in Matthew and Luke, he said, nobody knows the Son except the Father, nor does anybody know the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. So this Father and Son relationship is such that it's a package deal. That's why it's wrong to say the Jews have the true God if they're not believers. Some people will say, oh, Jews are okay. We don't have to worry about them. No, we do. We need to tell them the gospel. And that's actually, remember, Jesus is talking here to Jews. So he's talking to them, and they're the ones opposing him, and he's saying they don't know his Father. So Jesus doesn't take for granted that because they're the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, therefore they know God. Now, all this is just really the lead-in to what I want to get to. As the conversation goes on, there's this constant back and forth where Jesus says things which it's possible to understand a certain way. We have the benefit of the whole story, so we know what Jesus is saying in these cases, whereas these people on the ground are not yet fully informed. But one of the benefits that we have is the prologue. If you read the prologue, you already know what John is driving at in his gospel. It's kind of like, imagine reading the book of Job without reading the first 2 chapters. We'd be just as lost as Job's 3 friends. Maybe you're suffering because you sinned, Job. Maybe, this, that, or the other thing. We know from the first 2 chapters there's something entirely different going on. Where you read John's gospel without the prologue, and you're just as lost as the people in the story. What does he mean? Where he came from. And he knows where he came from and where he's going, and therefore whatever he says is true. What does he mean? If you knew my Father, you'd know me, and if you knew me, you'd know my Father, and I'm the light of the world. All this, you'd be tempted to make this sensible, right? You'd be tempted to think he's talking about some very important father, and we just don't know. Like maybe his father is the head of the local synagogue, or I don't know what the options are entirely, but that would be the temptation, the inclination to take him in some of these ways. But then it goes on to say, Jesus in verse 21 says, I am going away, and you'll seek me, and you'll die in your sins. Where I'm going, you can't come. So he's going a place they can't come, and as a result of their rejection of him, which leads to his departure, they're going to die in their sins. Then he says, John says, the Jews said, we will kill him, or will he kill himself, since he says, where I'm going, you can't come. He said to them, you're from below, I'm from above. You're of this world, I am not of this world. Now, even at this point, you can reduce this. The statement, I'm from above, you're from below. You can imagine another Christian saying to an unbeliever, this isn't the way we normally speak, but I'm from above, you're from below. I'm of God. I belong to God. You don't. But is that what Jesus means? So what I'm just driving at this point is just Jesus is talking in ways that would be provocative, and these people would be fishing around wanting him to be more explicit so that they can be more determined in their action. They want to stone him. They've been trying to stone him for a long time. So Jesus speaks in ways that they are trying to get to the bottom of. Now listen to verse 24. I told you that you would die in your sins, for unless you believe that I am he, you will die in your sins. Now, in the Greek text, this literally says, unless you believe that I am, you will die in your sins. This is a very significant manner of speaking. It's going to become even more apparent in a moment. But notice at this point, even apart from knowing anything about Old Testament background or anything else, Jesus ties this, what you believe on this matter, to the forgiveness of sins. Obviously, this is a weighty claim. If you don't believe that I am, you'll die in your sins. Everything turns on this. He's clearly not saying unless you believe I exist. That's not his point. They knew that. They were having a conversation with him. That was not in question. So something radical is being asserted here by Jesus, and he suspends forgiveness on it. Unless you believe I am, you will die in your sins. He goes on to speak further in ways similar to this. In verse 28, I'm skipping down, it says, so Jesus said to them, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am. So somehow the lifting up of the Son of Man will reveal to them that he is. Now, again, I think that it means he exists. That's not the point. There's something about who he is that determines their eternal weal or woe, whether they're forgiven or not. And there's something about him being lifted up that will reveal who he is. So something weighty is going on here. But now we begin to get into the heart of, this is what I was working up to. It says in verse 31, Jesus said to the Jews who had believed him, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples. And you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. They answered him, we are the seed of Abraham and have never been enslaved to anyone. How is it that you say you will become free? So now they bring up Abraham into the conversation. You remember what I was talking about before, about God appearing to Abraham? That's the Abraham they're talking about. I'm being a little pedantic, but I'm trying to get you to remember. We were looking at Abraham not long ago. We saw something of Abraham's experience. So this is that Abraham. They're saying we are his children. How can you be saying this stuff about us? There's all these ironies in the Gospels if you read them carefully, but at one point they'll say we've never been enslaved to anyone. And the whole statement, the whole point is, well, then you're not really the children of Israel. You're not really the people of God, because that's who they are by definition, those whom God delivered from slavery. So when they deny that they've ever been enslaved to anyone, they're basically saying we've forgotten that first statement repeatedly made in the Torah. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, therefore have no other gods besides me. Right? Well, here they're laying claim to Abraham, but they seem to have forgotten quite a bit of the story of Abraham. Watch what happens after they said they are the children of Abraham. Jesus answered them, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. The slave doesn't remain in the house forever. The Son remains forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. I know that you are the seed of Abraham, yet you seek to kill me because my word finds no place in you. I speak of what I have seen with my father, and you do what you have seen from your father. Here, notice what Jesus is doing here. He's saying you claim to be the children of Abraham, but there's something that seems to pose a problem. There's a snag here. Something doesn't seem right. He says, yet you're seeking to kill me. You say you're the children of Abraham, but this doesn't seem to square with that. I know you're the children of Abraham, but you're trying to kill me. Think this through. What is Jesus insinuating here? He's saying you're children of Abraham and you want to kill me. That doesn't fit. There's something wrong with you making this claim and wanting to kill me. It doesn't follow that you're children of Abraham from this. It seems to impair that. Watch how he goes on. If it's not clear to you yet what he's driving at, it becomes even clearer. In verse 39, it says, they answered him, Abraham is our father. Jesus said to them, if you were Abraham's children, you would be doing the works that Abraham did. But you are seeking to kill me, a man who's told you the truth that I heard from God. This Abraham did not do. Now, the Greek here is very pointed. When Jesus says this, you're supposed to think, what's the antecedent of this? What does this refer back to? He's saying they didn't do something specific. It's not general. It's not saying Abraham wasn't a bad guy. He didn't go around trying to kill people. He says, this Abraham did not do. What? What is it? He says, you're trying to kill me. This Abraham did not do. Abraham didn't try to kill me. That's what Jesus is saying here. Abraham, unlike you guys, didn't try to kill me. You're trying to kill me, and that shows you're not really the children of Abraham. If you were, you'd be just like Abraham was. What could Jesus possibly have in mind here? It's as if Jesus claims to know Abraham, and that there's some occasion when Abraham could have responded to him the way they are doing. But he didn't. He didn't try to kill Jesus. Maybe he was very hospitable. Think about that. What if Jesus appeared to him walking along the road? Just imagine if maybe he came from heaven with two angels, walked along the dusty trail, and then Abraham saw them and said, hey, let me wash your feet. Let me have Sarah make you some bread and bring out some food. You know, what if Jesus appeared to Abraham and said, I'm going to return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son? That's what I'm getting at, and that's what I think Jesus is getting at. He's saying, Abraham knew me. Abraham and I had a face-to-face knowledge with each other. Now, a lot of Christians begin to see this once you get towards the end of the chapter, but it's already at play earlier. That's what I'm trying to drive out here. It's in this context as you go on where the Jews eventually get it. They eventually realize Jesus is claiming far more here than we at first thought. If you go down to verse 48, it says, the Jews answered him, are we not right in saying that you're a Samaritan and have a demon? So now they're engaging in personal attacks. They're saying he's a product of a relationship, illicit relationship. His mother had relations with a Samaritan, and he has a demon. And then Jesus said, I do not have a demon, but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. Remember, if you knew me, you'd know my Father. So when he says you dishonor me, that's proof that you don't know the Father, and you dishonor the Father. He says, yet I do not seek my own glory. There's one who seeks it. That is my glory. There's somebody else who's concerned for my glory. And he is the judge. Truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death. The Jews said to him, now we know that you have a demon. Abraham died, as did the prophets. Yet you say, if anyone keeps my word, he'll never taste death. Are you greater than our father Abraham, who died? And the prophets died. Who do you make yourself out to be? Now this is pregnant Johannine terminology. Who do you make yourself out to be? Remember in John 5, when he's talking to other Jews outside of Israel. Well, no, this is John 5. It's in Israel. It's a festal occasion. They complain that Jesus healed a man on the Sabbath, and then to justify what he did, Jesus said, my Father's been working to this very day. So this is a example in Greek of what's known as a present, a past action, still in progress. God has been working up to this very day. So throughout the past, the Father has been working, even on the Sabbath. His work is without intermission. Always the Father's at work, in some sense. He's no longer creating as he was in the beginning, but he continues to uphold and govern the world, or we wouldn't still be here. So the Father's always been working. Nobody would charge him with breaking the Sabbath. Jesus says, my Father's been working to this very day. Me too. I too am working. That is, throughout the past with the Father up till the present. So if the Father's not guilty of violating the Sabbath, no, neither am I. And then it says the Jews wanted to stone him because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. So in their minds, he's making himself equal with God. Here it says, who do you make yourself out to be? Later in John 10, they'll complain when Jesus claims to give eternal life and to keep the sheep in his hands. And he'll say, for which good work do you want to stone me? Because they're ready to kill him. And they say, we don't want to stone you for a good work, but because you, being a man, make yourself God. This is a constant Johannine drumbeat. In John 19, when Jesus is being executed, or they're trying to determine his execution, they say, we have a law, and according to that law he must die because he made himself out to be the Son of God. So this is Johannine phraseology. It's all about, whenever you hear this language, it's all about the identity of Jesus as a divine person. They're asking, who do you make yourself out to be? They're finally putting their finger on it in this context. And then Jesus said, if I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It's my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God. But you have not known him. I know him. If I were to say that I don't know him, I'd be a liar like you. Actually, did I skip something? No, I didn't. Okay. It's very small print. I'd be a liar like you, but I do know him and I keep his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad. So the Jews said to him, you're not yet 50 years old and you have seen Abraham. Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham became, I am. Now you have not just an I am statement, but a deliberate and sharp verbal contrast. How much time do I have, by the way? I should have looked at my clock. You have a very sharp verbal contrast. Jesus doesn't just say, I am, but he says, 2 hours. Okay. He says, before Abraham became, I am. Now this is radical. It's not just, and it would have been fine to say this, as, you know, and it would be true to who Jesus is. If he said, before Abraham became, I was, then he'd be saying, I existed even before Abraham. But that's not what he does here. It's even more radical. Before Abraham was, I am. That's an expression of timeless existence. He's saying right now, I am, before Abraham. It's like Colossians 1. I love the expression there. Paul says in Colossians 1, after saying that Jesus made everything, it was all made for him and through him and so forth, he says, he is before all things, and in him all things subsist. He uses the present tense. He is, right now, before all things. He exists apart from all temporal reality. So we need to think in terms of temporal succession and so forth, and the scriptures often speak anthropomorphically in our language, so we understand. But when they speak strictly, they speak like this. He is. He's always existing. He has his whole existence always. There's no success. God doesn't have birthdays, right? He doesn't get a day older, doesn't get a new gray hair. He always is. He exists above the temporal order. Time is a creation of the world. A creation of God. It says in Hebrews 1, through the Son he created the ages. That's the literal Greek there. When it says created the worlds, it's the word ages. The ages were made through the Son. It says he loved us before the beginning of time. So time has a beginning. So when you see this language, it's an indication of eternal existence. But notice now he's answered this question. He knows Abraham. Abraham knows him. And the reason that's a possibility is because he's always existed. That's how it was the case that he knew Abraham. There's something interesting, though, tucked away here. It says, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day. Now he's saying Abraham not only knew him, but he was rejoicing, looking forward to some day that he's calling my day. But notice, that day is not the day when Jesus is standing there in their midst, because he refers to it as a day that's come and gone. He says, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day. He saw it and was glad. So there's some day in the past that Abraham rejoiced looking forward to it, and then when it came, it filled him with gladness, with joy, or you might say laughter, legitimate ways of rendering all this, laughter. Remember what happened in Genesis 18? I skipped over it then, but you should remember the story. When God said to Abraham, I'm going to give you a son, somebody was in the tent laughing at this. And the Lord says, why did Sarah laugh? And she says, I didn't laugh. And he says, yes, you did. Sarah laughed at first. When you get to the account of the actual birth of Isaac, we're told that Sarah's initial laughter of incredulity turns to joy. So much so that when the birth of the child takes place, she names him Isaac, which means rejoicing or laughter. Jesus is alluding to all this. This is the day that they were looking forward to, and he says, when it came to pass, it filled their hearts with joy and so forth. Jesus is saying, I know Abraham. Abraham didn't try to kill me like you're doing. Abraham was looking forward to my day, the day when I would come. Now, a couple other things I'm going to try and do very quickly, because I said that this is going to show you not only the Trinity, but give you an idea of how this sort of thing, or how this text and other texts speak in many ways to this. There's an interconnectedness to things that you can see certain things and you can make a lifetime out of seeing new things. Everybody here that's read the Bible for any amount of time can tell you they see new things all the time and they think, how did I miss that? Once you see it, you find, it's like, I don't know how I missed it before. It's not like it's not there clearly, but I guess I was dull or something. But in the Old Testament, there's a background to these I am statements. Most people think it's Exodus 3. I don't think it's irrelevant, but it would take a lot of time to work out how it's part of the background. But that's where God says to Moses, I am who I am. Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am sent me to you. One snag is that when you render that in Greek, it comes out differently than what you see here in John 8. It's not the same expression in Greek. Doesn't mean that the translators couldn't have rendered it that way. That's where I think you could make some connection. You can say the Hebrew could legitimately be rendered this way. However, there are at least 7 occurrences in the Old Testament where the Hebrew is different and the Jews did render it this way. In Deuteronomy 32, you have the first example. In Deuteronomy 32:39, the Lord says, see now that I am, there's no God besides me. I put to death, I make alive. It's I who wound, it's I who heal. And nobody can deliver or snatch out of my hands. So he gives life, he takes life. Life is his prerogative. It's in his hand. Nobody can stop him. Nobody can thwart him. He does what he wants. So that's the first I am statement. Now what makes this interesting, and you'll see why, is that this song was especially associated with the Feast of Tabernacles. There were various feasts in Israel, and this feast was one of the big 3. So they would go up to Jerusalem 3 times a year for these different, there's other feasts besides these 3, but these 3, the males were required to go up for these. One was the Feast of Tabernacles. Well, every 7 years at the Feast of Tabernacles, the entire law of God was supposed to be read in their hearing, the whole thing. Everybody had to stand there while it was read. Sun beating down on them and so forth. But when it wasn't the 7th year, they did other things, such as this Deuteronomy 32 is a song. It's part of a song. And God says there, he says, this is a last days song. That's where one of the times the last days occurs in the Old Testament. In Deuteronomy 31, it says, this is a song that will testify against you in the last days. It's going to testify against you in the last days. A testimony, right? Remember, testimony is important issue in this gospel, isn't it? In chapter 8, I testify of myself, my Father testifies of me. Here's this song that God taught the people to sing, and he said to Moses, this is going to be a testimony. It's going to testify against them in the last days. When they sin against me, they rebel, and I hide my face from them. Okay, I'm going to hide my face from them on that day. So this is the context of that song. How does John's gospel begin? John's gospel begins in the prologue by saying, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, tabernacled among us. So John's already telling you this gospel is all about the fulfillment of that feast. It's about more, but it's that included, right? Well, interestingly, when you get to John 7 through 10, it's all taking place at the Feast of Tabernacles. So one of the things this means is this song, remember they had to sing it every year at the Feast of Tabernacles. When Jesus said, before Abraham became, I am, they heard these words in the context of this event when they would hear or sing this song where God uttered his first I am statement. See now that I am, there's no God besides me. So this is the context in which Jesus makes not just one I am claim, 3. Right? Unless you believe I am, you'll die in your sins. When I'm lifted up, then you'll know that I am. Before Abraham became, I am. So he keeps saying, I am, I am, I am, in this context on the Feast of Tabernacles. When you go back to Deuteronomy 32:39, the Jews had something that were called Targums. The Targums were their Aramaic paraphrases. So they would take the Hebrew Bible, because they learned Aramaic when they were in exile in Babylon, and so this was a language that they would use to give interpretations in. This was to help distinguish it from the Hebrew text. Nobody would confuse, if they were saying it in Aramaic, nobody would confuse it with the text, but they would understand its commentary. So in the Aramaic paraphrases, they had alternative expressions. Sometimes when they spoke about God, especially when it was talking about God appearing in human form, they had a special way of referring to those human form appearances of God. If you don't know this, this will be huge for you right now. Others of you will still love this because you know it and you know how important it is. But the expression they used for these human form appearances of God was, in Aramaic, memra. In Greek, it's logos. In English, it's word. So when it talks about, in Genesis 19:24, for example, the passage I appealed to earlier, when it says the Lord rained fire and brimstone from the Lord out of heaven, the Targums say the word of the Lord rained fire and brimstone from the Lord out of heaven. So the one who appears on earth in the form of a man who's called Lord in the biblical text, in the Targums, is called the Word. So here's John. Put this all together. Here's John, a first century Jew. He hears this. This is common. This is stock in trade for Jews. By the way, if you've ever heard somebody say that the New Testament writers got this from paganism, this is part of their Jewish background. The pagans didn't have the same view of the word that John had, but John certainly wasn't farming this out to them. Hey, give me a way of talking about Jesus. Now, this is just part of his Jewish background. And this has a biblical precedent, by the way. Even in the Hebrew text, there are occasions of things like this. You've heard Genesis 3 where it says, they heard the voice walking in the garden in the cool of the day. You ever heard a voice walking? I haven't, right? Genesis 15, it says, the word of the Lord appeared to Abraham. Has a word ever appeared to you? And then, has a word spoken to you? Because it says, the word of the Lord appeared to Abraham and said to him. So the word is the one appearing and speaking. Right? So this expression is there, and this is where they get it from. And they use it to refer to other theophanies, other appearances of God. Well, here's why this is all important. If you look at the Targum of Deuteronomy 32:39, this song that was to be sung on the Feast of Tabernacles, this occasion, here's how it paraphrases it. When the word of the Lord appears in the future to redeem his people, he will say to them, I am he who is, and who was, and who will be. So they're taking the I am statement and they're unpacking it. They're saying this is what the word means. I am he who is and who was and who will be. It's a way of saying he's eternal, right? By the way, who's the only person in the New Testament that calls God that? The one who is and who was and who will be. It's John. In the book of Revelation, 1:4, 1:8, he calls God the one who is and was and is to come. So you know John's familiar with the Targums. So it says, though, that these are the words of the Word. It's the Word who will say this in the future. Well, this is the Feast of Tabernacles. And it's the Word, according to John, who's saying this. Now look at the ending line of this. It says in verse 59, they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. Remember what I said? God said in Deuteronomy 31, prior to giving this song, he says, I'm going to teach this song to you, and it's going to be a testimony against you in the latter days when you rebel against me, and then I'm going to hide my face from you. Here Jesus, in response to them rebelling against him, hides his face and leaves the temple. It's all, even the actions of Jesus are symbolic. God departing from the temple, right? Ichabod, remember the Old Testament when God is fed up with the people's sins, and he says he's departing the temple, and then the temple was destroyed and then rebuilt. One more thing, if I've got a couple minutes. I'll wait until they drag me off. How's that? In 1022, you have a new context. It's a new occasion. It's called the Feast of Dedication. The Feast of Dedication was not a biblically prescribed feast. It was based on things that happened in the intertestamental period when the temple had been rededicated after it had been polluted through the acts of Antiochus Epiphanes and so forth. So it's rededicated. And so the Jews began to celebrate this occasion. They didn't have biblical precedent for this, and they were very worried about doing anything God didn't prescribe. So what they decided to do, they wanted to commemorate this significant event, so they decided to pattern their celebration after the Feast of Tabernacles. So in some Jewish literature, this is called Second Tabernacles. So put together what this means, it means that they would be doing all the stuff they did at Tabernacles, like singing the song of Deuteronomy 32. That's one of the things they would have done on this occasion. All the things they did at Tabernacles, they did on this occasion. Well, it's in this context where Jesus goes on to say that he gives his sheep eternal life, right? And they will never perish, neither can anybody snatch them out of my hand. Now that should be more recognizable to you. That's the last part of Deuteronomy 32:39. See, now that I am, it's I who put to death and make alive, it's I who wound, it's I who heal, and nobody shall deliver out of my hand. It's almost exactly the same in the two texts. There's a slight difference, but Eddie suggested this to me once. In the Greek version of Deuteronomy 32, it says, nobody shall deliver out of my hands. It's plural. When Jesus says it, it's singular. Nobody can deliver out of my hand. But if you read the rest of John 10, there's another hand, isn't there? Jesus said, they're also in the Father's hand, and nobody can deliver them out of his hand. So there's an interesting possibility there that the reason it becomes singular in the case of it, because the plural is used to refer to both Father and Son. I just lightly suggest that, but that's the basic difference between the citations. No Jew would have missed this. Jesus claims to be the I am, and he claims what only God can claim, and he claims it in the very context where it would have been most relevant at the Feast of Tabernacles, and everything plays out exactly as that song says it would. By the way, this song is quoted several times in the New Testament, applied to Jesus, applied to Jesus, applied to Jesus. Hebrews 1:6 says, let all the angels of God worship him. In the Greek translation of this, that's from Deuteronomy 32:43. In 1 Corinthians 10, he says that it's not appropriate for believers to knowingly and to the detriment of other believers partake of food sacrificed to idols. There's a whole sophisticated theology there I won't go into, but he says to do this is to partake of the cup of demons and the table of demons. And he says this is entirely wrong. He's using terminology from Deuteronomy 32, where it talks about the cup of demons and the table of demons. He's saying you can't eat from Christ's table and theirs. In 1 Corinthians 10, Paul says that Jesus is the rock that followed them. Right? They passed through the cloud and in the sea with Moses, and Jesus was the rock that nourished them spiritually. If you go to Deuteronomy 32, the title, the rock, is used there repeatedly for God. God is our rock. God is our rock. God is our rock. We know no other rock. He's our only rock. So the New Testament is consistent in the use of this. So my point is I'll summarize here because I'm assuming that I'm done. Here's a text that very clearly shows us, I know I didn't talk much about the Spirit, but after laying this kind of groundwork, the Spirit follows easily with this. Once you allow for the possibility of God being more than one person, all the walls that are put up against the Spirit have fallen with them. Right? Usually the principled objection is God can't be both one and more than one. Well, he is. Jesus proves that. And once that's proven, well then all it takes is a couple of observations about the Spirit, and there's more than a couple. Right? But what I'm trying to show from this is it's very clearly taught in the New Testament. It's consistent with the Old Testament. And it's rich. There's a richness here. You can read this story. I love this. I don't know who it was in the ancient church. Somebody said, it was one of the Gregories, and somebody will remember the saying better than I do, but the gist of it is the Bible is like water that's shallow enough for children to play in, splash around in, but it's deep enough for theologians to drown in, right, or something like that. The idea is it's both simple and profound. You'll understand it just reading it, and it'll be all the more meaningful the more you plumb its depths. And here's an example of that. You could just read this text and see Jesus is claiming to be God. But the more you bring the Old Testament into account, the more you see is going on here. He's using the title for God in the Old Testament. It's the very occasion. Even the Jewish religious sources that they use to explain the Bible are being incorporated into all this. I mean, it's wondrously rich. And I'll conclude with that.
Okay, thank you, Reverend Rogers. Now we're going to have Reverend Samuel Green come up and talk about the incarnation.
Okay, so what time do you want me to finish?
30 minutes.
30 minutes.
Yes.
Now, I need to get something down here. Okay, so I want to have a very practical session about talking about the incarnation with Muslims. In order to do this, we do need to understand our theology well, and so hopefully I'll be able to break down some ways of doing that for you. There's a chapter in my book on this, and I'm doing a shameless book plug. One of the things I did when I wrote my book was I wrote it as an evangelist, and I would read amazing books written by Christians, but then have to go and figure out myself how to put it into practice. What I did in my book was I said, I really wish that those people had helped me to put that into practice. So what I've done with my book is each chapter has a booklet that you can download and use in evangelism. And so it takes a summary of what I've said in that chapter and puts it into a format that you can use. And what I'm going to present to you now is in a booklet called, Is Jesus God? And so the paper size may not work with American paper sizing, but we're in the process of converting that. So, because of time, I'm just going to go down to here. So when I'm talking with my Muslim friends about the divinity of Jesus, when I started talking to my Muslim friends about the divinity of Jesus, I was having this type of discussion with them. And hopefully you can see that there. See diagram 1? And that is, I'd be talking to them and thinking, look, we both agree that there's one God and that God is the creator. And, we agree about God, right? We agree about God. And we agree, about creation. God made everything. We agree about that. And we agree about humanity. We agree that God made people. God made man, Adam and Eve. But where we disagree is Jesus. And so we have these discussions and arguments about Jesus, okay? So that's how I was understanding the discussions that I had with people. And so, we agree about God, we agree that he made everything, we agree about humanity, but we disagree about Jesus, and the result of disagreeing about Jesus is that there's a Muslim Jesus and there's a Christian Jesus. And so we argue across here, I hope everyone can see that, we argue across here as to, is the Muslim view of Jesus right, or is the Christian view of Jesus right? So our argumentation is across here. And that's what I did for many years in my evangelism when I was talking to Muslims. But what I came to see was that this diagram is wrong. That's not true. That's not actually what's happening when you're talking to a Muslim. You think that's what's happening. And so, this is what I saw in most of the books that I was reading about Jesus and talking to Muslims about him, that we'd be looking at verses from the New Testament about Jesus and comparing them to verses in the Quran, and we're talking about Jesus. That situation is wrong. The truth is actually diagram 2 on your right-hand side. And that is that Muslims have a different understanding about God. They have a different understanding about God. They have a different understanding about creation. They have a different understanding about what it means to be human. And because they have a different understanding of God, creation, and humanity, they have a different understanding of Jesus. That is actually the discussion you're having with people. So what happens is, let me go around here. We've got all these differences here when it comes to God, creation, and humanity. We're not talking about that. We're talking about Jesus down here. And we tend to make little progress. We might make progress, but we tend to make less progress. So what I came to see was we need to go back and discuss up here first. We need to discuss, what is God like? How does God interact with his creation? What does it mean to be human? Because if you don't agree with God, if you don't agree with Muslims about what God is like, and you don't agree with them as to what it means to be human, do you think you'll agree about Jesus, who is the God-man, when you don't agree with either of those terms? So that's what I want to quickly do now. And again, I do this in more detail in my book, and we're getting near the end, and you might be getting a bit tired, so I'm just going to give us a brief time overview of this now. So we need to talk about God first. What's God like? If a Muslim says to you, how can God become a man? You need to say, well, what is God like? And the first question I think we need to ask is, how does God interact with creation? Now, diagram 1 shows what would be sort of a Greek philosophical view, which was very prominent at Jesus' time. And it's also sort of the view of Hinduism to some degree. Oh, no, sorry, not Hinduism. I won't worry about that. That's the next one. I jumped ahead of myself. So a common view is that God is one. And he is so much one that he's unchangeable in any way, and he cannot in any way connect with the physical world, the physical universe. Because the physical universe is changing. The physical universe is all diverse. There's all diversity around it. How can a God who is pure oneness and unchanging interact with all the physical world, which is all changing and diverse? And so what this view says is that God created something a bit less than himself, a spiritual being less than himself. This is what Arius believed. God created something a bit less than himself, who then made other things, and then there's this ladder. This is called the ladder of being. And so God actually can't touch creation. And so in Greek philosophy, God is not the creator. He doesn't touch creation. Arius, Arius in church history, who denied the divinity of Jesus, or he didn't deny the divinity of Jesus, he denied that Jesus was eternal with God forever. He actually believed that God was not the creator. We don't often think about that when we think about Arius. Arius denied that the ultimate God was the creator. So this is one view of God. Now, see, is that what we believe as Christians? Well, no, that's not what we believe, is it? This is another common view. So what I'm doing now is cosmology. And we don't often talk about cosmology, but it's really important about how does God interact with his creation. This is more the Hindu view, isn't it? This is pantheism. God, all is one. Up here, God is one, and all the diversity and stuff is down here. But over here, all is one. Everything's one. And all the diversity around us is just an illusion. That's Hinduism, isn't it? In Hinduism, all the diversity, the distinction between you and me, it's an illusion. All is one. Now, is that what the Bible teaches? Well, no. The Bible doesn't teach that, does it? The Bible actually teaches this. It teaches that God, yes, God is transcendent, but God interacts with his creation through his word and spirit. That's how God interacts with his creation. God is his own agent into creation through his word and spirit. And so God is not locked out of his creation. See, in this one, God's locked out. He can't touch the physical. He didn't even make the physical. And he's locked out of it. And so, see, if you believe this, which is what most of the people in the first century Greek world believed, and then you were told that Jesus is God, you'd say, no, he can't be God because God can't touch the physical, can't even touch it. But if you're a Hindu and you were told that Jesus is God, you'd say, sure. So for Hindus, telling them Jesus is God is no big deal. So for this type of cosmology, which is your Greek philosophy, the incarnation is impossible, and that's why Arius said Jesus wasn't the eternal God. This is why the Docetists and the Gnostics said that Jesus didn't have a real body. They believed he was God, but of course, if he's God, it can't be physical, so he was only an appearance. He's like a projector, like just a projection. That's all Jesus was. He was just a projection. But over here, the incarnation, it's not special. There's nothing special about it. I just want to bring those up because how God interacts with his creation is actually really important. Now, when we see God with his creation, we see that the Creator God actually connects with his creation. The Creator God connects with creation. And the Christian heretics of the first century overwhelmingly were people who said God does not connect with his creation. In the early centuries, the people who denied the incarnation were the people who denied that God can connect with his creation. But of course, the Creator God connects with his creation, doesn't he? He connects with it. You see, when God created the universe, when he created all things, there was some connection between him and creation. If there's no connection, then he didn't do it. Right? When God is sustaining your life, just think about this. God is sustaining your life right now. What does that mean? That means that there's a connection between you and God. In fact, there's not just a connection, but let's think about this connection. There's a connection between the eternal, divine nature of God. There's a connection of one nature, the divine nature, to a created nature. You see, when God created, there were two natures with some type of connection, some type of union between them. When God's sustaining your life, there are two natures with some type of union between them. You see, God is not locked out of his creation. Now, this is important because when we talk about the incarnation of Jesus, we say he has two natures. Well, that doesn't begin with Jesus. I'm not saying the incarnation is not a unique expression. It's a unique expression of it, absolutely. But the very doctrine of creation says that God connects with his creation. The very doctrine of God sustaining says that God connects with his creation. And when you have that connection, it's of two different natures. Now, the incarnation is a new and beautiful expression of this. It's unique. But it's not novel. It's built upon the doctrine of creation. Now, you need to think through these things. And as I said, I've got a booklet which will help explain these things to you. But the doctrine of creation is the first foundation for the incarnation. And there is no reason for a Muslim to deny the incarnation if they believe God is the creator. Because if God's the creator, he connects with his creation. And this is one of the first points I would bring up with a Muslim. I would just say, does God connect with his creation? What are you saying? Are you saying that God is locked out, he can't touch it? Well, if you're saying he sustains your life, you're saying he's connected to you. Is God sustaining you or not? This is the first foundation that I think we need to consider. It's the hardest one to consider. They're easier from here on in. But I think that's just because as Christians we haven't done enough work on our doctrine of creation. Everything really, in one sense, comes out of the doctrine of creation. So that's my first point. You've got to understand the doctrine of creation. My second point is that God accommodates himself to us. Now, what do I mean by this? What I mean is, and I'll use the word infinite for God. There's a discussion as to whether or not you should say God is all, or you should say, God is infinite. Now, I'll use the phrase infinite because that's how the argument often comes to us. People will say, God is infinite. He's infinite in power, infinite in knowledge, infinite in all these things. And, a man is finite. A human is finite. So how can the infinite God fit into a finite person? Like, he just won't fit, And so I've had Jehovah's Witnesses say that to me, how do you do that? Well, this is because God accommodates himself to his creation. This is the doctrine of accommodation. Calvin brings this up in his Institutes. But God accommodates himself. So think about it. Every single time the infinite God interacts with his creation in any way, it's finite, isn't it? Any way. So when God made the universe, we now know the universe has got a particular size. It's finite. So when the infinite God made everything, it's a finite creation, yet it's still a true expression of his infinite power. What about the Word of God? When God speaks to us, when God speaks his word, it's a finite word. The Bible doesn't go on forever. It's a finite word that God speaks. Yet his finite word is a true representation of the infinite God. You see, the finite can represent the infinite. This is just the doctrine of creation. The doctrine of accommodation. I'm not doing anything Christian at this stage. I'm just in Genesis 1 and 2. Okay, so there's the doctrine of accommodation. Now, I looked at this earlier if you're in one of my other groups, but the third thing about God is that God's plan has always been to come and dwell with us. So when God made Adam and Eve, God walked with them in the cool of the evening and God dwelt with humanity. Humanity, because of its sinfulness, loses the presence of God. And so God brings his judgment through the flood, and then he makes a new nation through the man Abraham. And then through Abraham, they become the nation of Israel. They build the tabernacle, and then the glory of God comes, and God dwells with humanity again. That tabernacle becomes a temple. That temple's destroyed, but the prophets say there is a new temple, a resurrection temple coming for the new age, for the new heavens and the new earth. There's a new resurrection temple coming in which God and man will dwell perfectly together. Okay? So this is God's plan. Now, what's that saying? That's actually saying that God comes to dwell with his people. In John chapter 2, when Jesus describes himself, he says, I will rebuild this temple in 3 days. I'll destroy this physical temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. And they say he was talking about his own body. You see, when Jesus describes himself, he talks about a well-attested to Old Testament pattern of God coming to dwell with his people. Now, I hope you can see that, actually, no, is there a new one here? I've got a new one which I'll add here. The other one is when God made us, he breathed his own spirit into us. Just think about that. It means the breath of life that comes from God is animating you now. That's some connection, isn't it? Now, I hope you can see that with the idea of those 4 points, that there's really no grounds for a Muslim to reject the incarnation. God is the creator. He connects with creation every single time he interacts with it. Okay, the incarnation is the fulfillment of God interacting with his creation, of connecting with it. He accommodates himself to us every single time he interacts with us. Whenever God interacts with creation, it's an act of accommodation. Well, that's Philippians 2. You read Philippians chapter 2 there. Your mind should be the same as that of Christ. Your attitude should be the same of Christ. Even though he was in the very form of God, he humbled himself, took on the nature of a man. That's God accommodating himself to us. But God always accommodates himself to us. Jesus talks about himself as the temple. God always comes to us. That's always been his plan to do this. I hope you can see that the incarnation is built on solid foundations. And by the time you go through these, so when I debate with Muslims on this, I bring this up, they never go near any of this. They want to talk about other stuff. They don't want to talk about creation because it gives the grounds for the incarnation. They don't want to talk about accommodation because they realize, well, that justifies the incarnation. I want to move on, so I've only got 9 minutes. So we also need to talk about humanity, right? So we've got to be clear about who God is. And I hope you can see, once you understand who God is, the incarnation almost falls over in terms of just falling into place. What about humanity? Well, we're made in the image of God. Now, what does that mean, to be made in the image of God? Well, it talks about the image and likeness. They're the words for correspondence. There's a correspondence between us and God. So if you actually believe that humanity is made in the image of God, then there's a correspondence between us and God. There's a compatibility, as I said before in one of the Q&A sessions, where we're told, be holy as I am holy. So think about this. A human can display the character of God. Well, that's a pretty important thing to know, isn't it? That a human can display the character of God, that there's a correspondence between us. We represent, well, Genesis chapter 1 actually says, let us make man in his image and let him rule. So humans are meant to mediate the rule of God into this world. This is what a human can do. A human can mediate the rule of God. A human can mediate the character of God. A human has this correspondence between him and God, her and God, that God himself made into our creation. I hope you can see that. What's the problem with the incarnation? This is very easy to bring up with a Muslim. Like if a Muslim says to you, how can God become a man? I think one of the first places to start is to say, God made us in his image. Let's talk about the image of God, because they don't have that in the Quran. So if you've got the idea that humanity is nothing like God at all, there's no connection between us at all, then of course it would be logical to say that God can't take to himself a human nature. But when God takes to himself a human nature, he is taking to himself a nature that he himself made with the purpose of representing his rule, displaying his character, sharing in his glory. The incarnation's pretty reasonable, isn't it? In fact, I would argue that being made in the image of God was for the purpose of the incarnation. Let's just go through here. Oh, that's the one I was going to look at. God shares his life. So just putting this all together, we see that the incarnation is actually perfectly reasonable. And when I debate these subjects, the Muslims don't want to go near the image of God because they know they'll lose. They don't want to go near the doctrine of creation or accommodation or God dwelling because it's overwhelming evidence for how the incarnation's quite reasonable. And so the incarnation it's illogical with the Islamic understanding of God and humanity, but it's not illogical for us as Christians. Now, there's something else you can do, and that is you can also show Muslims that their hostility to the incarnation is something that is even too strong for even the Quran. So I've just got a couple of references here. And again, these are all on the booklet. Because Muslims actually believe that they will see Allah in creation. They'll see God in creation. I had a debate with the Muslim metaphysician. You may know him. He's a convert from Christianity. And I had a great time. I was terrified going into it, but at the end I was having a great time. And I brought up these verses. Let's have a look at them. Some faces that day will be radiant, looking at their Lord. And it's speaking there about the day of resurrection, where you're raised up in the new creation, and you're going to see God. Well, hang on. How can you, in creation, how can a Muslim see God? How can they see God? And then here is a hadith going into more detail about this. Narrated Abu Sa'id al-Khudri. We said, O Allah's apostle, shall we see our Lord on the day of resurrection? He said, do you have any difficulty in seeing the sun and the moon when the sky is clear? We said, no. He said, so you will have no difficulty in seeing your Lord on that day, as you have no difficulty in seeing the sun and the moon in a clear sky. Then the Almighty will come to them in a shape other than the one which they saw the first time. And he will say, I am your Lord. Just think about that. They're saying that you are going to see Allah in some shape, that you'll see the face of God. So I can also ask my Muslim friend, well, can you explain that to me? How is it that God is going to be present in creation? Because Islam actually has its own incarnation. It actually has its own incarnation. I'll finish up with an illustration because I just want to, I've still got a few minutes. So here's a story that I use with my Muslim friends and in debates. I'll say to them, I want you to imagine two kings. And for both of these kings, the king's people, his servants, are having a difficult time. His people are suffering. Things are difficult for these people. And so the two kings have to do something to help their people. Now, one king sends out commands to the people and says, try to do these commands, and if you do these commands, then things will, in the end will get better for you. That's one king. The other king leaves his palace. The other king leaves his palace and comes down and gets beside his people in their suffering. and he helps his people in their suffering. Now, which is the greatest king? Which is the greatest king? The second king, right? And so I use this one because Muslims will often say Allah is great. Now, Allahu Akbar. God is great, and God is too great to become a man. That's a wrong understanding of greatness, isn't it? Again, in my booklet, I take you through where Jesus talks about this. But that's the illustration, and I want to give you that illustration because I think it's a very easy story to remember. 2 kings in 2 palaces. Which is the greatest one? The one who gives you rules and says, keep these rules and you might get better? Or the one who says, I come down with you and I'm going to come with you and help to lift you up? So I'm going to finish up there and I'll hand back to Eddie.
All right, thank you. All right, what we're going to do is we're going to finish up with our last panel discussion led by, let's see, Olin. And we're going to have Anthony, Samuel, and Laura come back up. And this will be our last panel. So if you guys want to make your way on up here.
All right. Well, the crowd's getting thin out there. Thank you for sticking with us. In this last panel discussion, I want to kind of turn the focus inwardly and look a little more at the church, and that's what my questions are going to be dealing with. And as I prepared for this, I couldn't help but think of a quote by Joshua Lingle, and it says, he says, "The greatest problem in the world is not radical Islam. It is a nominal Christianity. The answer to global jihad is a discipled and trained church that loves Jesus." So let's start by talking about a discipled and well-trained church. What do you think what does that look like practically? I mean, this is where my heart's at, and I know it's your heart as well. God has given us a tremendous opportunity by bringing these Muslims to us. This is the reason we do these conferences. We want to see Muslims come to Christ. This is the reason we study. We put forth all this effort to make disciples that make disciples. And I know it's kind of a broad question, but what do you think this looks like practically? What do we need to do to get the church to wake up and to see this need, and how can they do that practically?
I think one thing we need to do is stop watering things down so much and expecting so little of one another, and to equip the saints with the reasons for the hope that we have, of course, to equip at a young age. I've actually never had much of any desire to work with children, and certainly not middle schoolers, but I saw several studies showing that even though it's in college, that students usually stop going to church and stop practicing the faith in that, stop walking through the motions, going through the motions. It's actually it's usually in middle school that they decide that Christianity is not true. They keep going for the pizza parties and the water balloon fights and the girl they have a crush on, and because their parents told them to, but they've decided that this is just a fun time, and if I have to pretend like there's some flying spaghetti monster to follow my parents' rules or meet up with my friends or have fun at the getaway, then that's what I'll do. But they do not know reasons for the hope that we have. They don't know the evidence for Christianity. They think it's just kind of a social club. And so when they meet new friends in college where it's not popular to pretend there's a flying spaghetti monster, they stop. And so I've actually started teaching a middle school apologetics group, and the kids, a lot of people told me, you can't teach kids that stuff. I don't even know that stuff. Adults were telling me this. So, well, then I guess we need to have a class for adults too. And so, but the kids are getting it. They are absolutely getting it. They are even blowing away my expectations, which were pretty high compared to most people's. And so, we, and my pastor keeps saying, okay, you kept saying, well, then we need an adult class. So when are we going to start that? But I really, that's why I do apologetics conferences. That's why I read apologetics books instead of going out with friends or watching TV. So I think that's one place.
I have thought about this for a long time, because motivating the church to think about Islam is not an easy thing. As I pointed out in my first presentation, Islam does not naturally come up in the Bible. And so for a lot of Bible-teaching Christians, it just doesn't naturally come up. One of the ways that I've tried to get around this is by developing tools for the non-specialist. So I guess, certainly for those of us up here, we're specialists in this area. But we need to make it accessible to people who aren't. And so I've got an article at the moment on the Engaging with Islam front page. It's a website called Answering Islam. Answering Islam. And it's called Sermon Illustrations and Islam. And what I've done is I've tried to make it really simple for a preacher who doesn't know about Islam to know how to use Islamic information in his sermons as illustrations and examples. So, for instance, there are a couple of verses, and it was a verse in a hadith where Muhammad says he does not know what will happen to him when he dies. That's an amazing thing. How many evangelistic preachers could easily use that in their sermon? They just need to know where it is. Or that Muhammad was affected by black magic and he had to have, sort of go through a process to get rid of the evil from him. Well, just contrast that to Jesus casting out demons. And you're not misrepresenting Islam at this point. You're actually taking it on its own terms. And so what I'm trying to do there is to take this information and make it really accessible. So to me, this seems to be one of the problems that your minister, who is busy with other things, just doesn't know how to incorporate Islam into his regular teaching. And for those of us who are specialists, we need to figure out how do we do this. And so if you want to have a look at my article, Sermon Illustrations in Islam, that's my attempt at doing that.
I've always thought, in answering from a more broad perspective, I think it really starts with the pastors of churches. Too many pastors are literally uncredentialed and not qualified in terms of what they're supposed to teach. Because today, too many pastors are cruise ship directors, and there's no doctrine at all. Paul says he was in prison for the defense and confirmation of the gospel. He also says to Timothy, which is two pastors, of course, to accurately handle the word of truth. Accurately handle. And the verb there, it's a participle. It's an ongoing thing. You got pastors, you got to keep accurately handling the word of truth. It denotes precision. And when you don't have precision, we don't have a doctrinal importance. When you don't have a clear understanding of apologetics, you're not going to see things like Islamic issues and other groups even being taught beyond the pulpit, because too many pastors have a very defective view when it comes to Christian apologetics. And Scripture is very clear on this. Consider this, virtually, except Philippians and Philemon, every single one of Paul's letters was written to undeceive the church, written to provide some kind of refutation to false teachings. Jesus also talked about that. Today, pastors aren't concerned, too many. There are some really good churches out there, but we don't have enough teaching pastors out there. And I think I mentioned this before. When I travel, a lot of times, if I'm speaking on the Trinity or something essential, or even on apologetics, I'll ask the question, how many people here in the last 10 years have ever heard a message on the Trinity in any church, at any church? I don't get any hands. I'll ask the same question about justification, no hands. But if I ask about eschatology or end times, all the hands go up. That's the problem. That's the essential problem. Pastors need to be precise. Remember the Puritans. They were called Puritans as a derogatory term, but they were also, before that, called precisionists in a derogatory way, because they were so fastidious and punctiliar. They wanted to be accurate, as if that was a bad thing. Pastors should be precisionists. It's their job. If you can't do it, maybe step down and be the hospital visitation person. But don't be a pastor. Don't insult the letters of Paul. And I think the core issue is training pastors to understand what biblical apologetics is, training them to understand that you need to be doctrinally centric, and then they'll then they'll start hopefully infecting their church. I've seen it happen a lot, where you have good teaching pastors, then you have programs with apologetics, then you have Christians who are no longer biblically illiterate, but they're bold Christians, just roaring lions of faith, understanding doctrine and proclaiming the gospel in a very definitive way, not merely giving them Jeremiah 29:11 or some unevangelistic passage. So I think it starts with pastors being teaching pastors. Then you'll see things change.
He was just bending iron a minute ago, so he's still worked up. No, it's I was, before Samuel even answered, I was remembering back to what he said the other day, and he brought it back up about what I'll call apologetical preaching. I've taken homiletics courses. I went through seminary. I'm a pastor. I go into prisons. And I remember the things that are brought up in the homiletics courses and the things that were not brought up. One of the things that wasn't brought up very often was the need to be apologetical from the pulpit. And but the reason I was thinking of this is because Samuel's mentioned something I thought about a lot, where every Muslim has a kind of confidence to go into a conversation because he thinks his God has informed him about our position. Most Christians don't have that. They don't think we know anything about Islam unless we've gone out and studied their writings. So they go into a conversation. It's a false confidence. They think that you believe certain things, and Allah told you what you believe, or them what you believe. So they have a kind of confidence. But, what's interesting is, even though the Bible, and this should be problematic from their perspective, even though the Bible never says anything about their religion, it says a whole lot that has direct application to their religion. And I think, one of the things I always think about, how do you miss an opportunity like this? In Acts 19, the apostles are ministering in Ephesus, and in Ephesus they're committed to Artemis of the Ephesians. And because the apostolic preaching has undermined the worship of Artemis and the idol factory that they had. They're cranking out idols in the worship of Artemis. So this is undermining their religion and their business. And so they form a council and they get upset and they start crying out. Basically, they want blood. They're going to go after Paul and so forth. But one of the things they start saying is, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. In other words, Artemis Akbar, right? Allahu Akbar. And they're in a rage and they want to kill the apostles. Doesn't that sound like Islam? So it doesn't mention Allah, but it's every bit relevant. The principles are there. How do you not make application to Islam? But another one I always think of is in 1 Kings 18, where Elijah squares off against the Baal worshippers. And this one has particular relevance to Islam for a number of reasons, but one is Elijah says it's not okay to worship God and then mix with that the stuff that you're picking up from the Baal worshippers. Because people wanted to be ecumenists. They wanted to say, we can mix these things, take a cafeteria approach to religion, what God says in the Bible, what the prophets of Baal are saying. But the reason this is, I think, particularly interesting is, so that you've got this god Baal and he's got these prophets, and Elijah's going to have this showdown and show who the true God is. They go up Mount Carmel and they organize this showdown, and each party's going to cry out to their God, and the God that answers by fire and consumes the sacrifice shows that he is the true God. And the Baal worshippers go up first. Elijah knew, they had to go up first because they weren't going to perform anything. So this sets it up, right? If he went up and it happened, then, I don't know, maybe everybody would leave after that, and they wouldn't get to see that the Baal worshippers couldn't duplicate this. But in any case, the Baal worshippers try to get their deity to respond, and he doesn't. So they get louder, and he doesn't respond, and then they begin cutting themselves. There's actually a whole sect of Islam that does this. In commemoration of an event in their history, they cut themselves and so forth. But they're always prone to being feverish in the service of their deity. Sometimes the terrors, the acts that they get into are a result of them getting worked up on a particular occasion. So you see the same sorts of things, but here's what's interesting. They're calling upon Baal. Well, in the Islamic context, when Muhammad began to promote this new religion, there were hundreds of deities worshipped by the Arabs. They had all sorts of idols around the Kaaba. Muhammad came along and he didn't reject all their deities. He kept one, and he just claimed this is the true God, right? All the others had to go. They're not to be associated with Allah. Well, Allah was the particular name of their deity, but it was a general term that came to be used in a specific way, but another term that was used, you can read the sources, was Hubble. They called the chief deity of their pantheon, the god of the Quraysh tribe that Muhammad was a part of, they called him Hubble in the sources. Now, some Muslims don't like this, but it's a fact. They called him Hubble. Well, the reason this is interesting is because the introduction of Hubble worship came into Arabia when an Arab went to a group of Midianites and so forth, and they said that the reason it rains or doesn't rain is because they pray to this statue of their god, and as a consequence, rain falls and so forth. So they brought this back to Arabia, and that's the introduction of, that's their sources. This is Muslim sources saying this. This is the introduction of Hubble worship into their religion. Well, when you look into who the Midianites and others worshiped, they worshiped Baal. So who's this Hubble character? Well, it's not a far, even sound-wise, you can tell, right? Hubble, Baal, sounds similar. Well, in Hebrew, when the Baal worshippers were crying out to their god, they're crying out to him to respond with fire. They were saying, he is Baal, he is Baal. That's their god. He is Baal. Well, in Hebrew, the word for he is who. And who is, there's a mnemonic device, who is he is she is who. There you just learned 3 words in Hebrew. Who in Hebrew means he. So when you say hu Baal, you're saying he is Baal. You don't need the verb. It's I don't want to get too technical, but just saying Hu and Baal, by using this pronoun and the noun, you're making a noun sentence. So the verb is implied. He is Baal. That's Hu-Baal, Hu-Baal. So eventually the deity is simply called Hubal. And this is the deity that was the chief deity of Islam's pantheon. The reason I think this is significant now is, how do you miss then, when you're preaching in 1 Kings 18, an opportunity to talk about Allah? Allah, whether you see the historical connection here or not, you've got this pagan deity that is vying for your allegiance over against the true God, and that God didn't respond by fire, our God did, and then you can, you work with the rest of that.
All right, excellent. I was tempted to pass over this question. I think it gets asked quite a bit, but it's a very important question, and it's for Laura. How important is it to train Christian women to share with Muslim women?
Yeah, it's really important, and the primary reason is because there's such a separation of the sexes in Muslim cultures. And so I've spent time in Egypt, Jordan, with Muslims in India, in Afghanistan, all over the Muslim world. And I rarely interacted with a man. And I was with women all the time. And there's a reason for that. That is culturally mandatory. And so women are not permitted to just go sit under the teaching of male missionaries or anything, anything in person. They sit in the back room in the mosque, and they can see the imam and the services on the TV, hear them in the ones that I've been to. But there's this huge separation, and so in order to reach Muslim women, although the age of the internet is changing that to some degree, we do need women to go and talk to women, meet with women, speak with women. And it's the women who are charged with teaching, passing on the religion to the children, the boys and the girls. And so the mother's understanding of Islam gets passed on, and the boys grow up, they know and remember what their mother taught them. So in my experience as well, the father has very little interest or role in that at all. So this is how Islam is getting passed on, is through the women. And so Christian women need to be ministering to Muslim women.
All right, thank you, Laura. The latest Barna research says that the number one worldview in America is now syncretism, this hodgepodge of different beliefs coming together. And of course, it brings to mind Chrislam. I'm just curious as to how big of an issue this is, if you've dealt with this in your ministry work, and maybe you could share a little bit about what this is and how you dealt with it.
So Chrislam, for those who may not know, is the belief that we can have a fusion of Christianity and Islam, and they can coexist and be together. The only comment I want to make there, well, two comments, is obviously they can't. But you do need to be gentle with people as you discuss this with them. So I used to be a soccer coach, and there are a couple of Muslim boys in my soccer team, and there was the Muslim father had married a Christian mother, and the young boys wanted to be, they loved both their parents. They love both their parents, and so they would call themselves Christian Muslims because I love my mum, I love my dad, you know. So how do you go forward in that? You go forward gently and giving them time to work it out because they love their parents and they're not in a position to know any different. And yeah, that's all I want to say. I want to say we can't combine them, but from mixed marriages, you still want to be gentle with people.
I used to hear more about Chrislam in the past. I don't know if it's dwindled. I just know I don't hear about it as much, which may not mean anything. I mean, America and some of the reasons for doing it that people have are usually because they're in a particular context. I've heard people, to me, some things that make sense to people, I think, make no sense. As an example, I've known people that say they'll go to a context where they want to bring Christianity, and so they'll become, let's say, an English teacher. Now that makes sense to me, but it's when they say, we're never going to talk about Jesus really, maybe here and there, like I'll introduce an English term, like maybe I'll use the word Jesus, like Christians in English-speaking country call Isa Jesus, and they'll go for years doing stuff like this, and I'm thinking, you've never gotten at any point to what they need to know to be saved. They're just as lost as they ever were apart from your help, you know. So I've always thought, and I understand though the incremental thing, like you're maybe working towards a conversation or something, that's different, but I'm thinking of just people that have this long-term thing where they're never really going to be confront them with the claims of Christ. But Chrislam is an attempt to, there's different versions of it, I guess. There are people that will go along acting as though they're Muslims with the goal of getting them to become Christians, but they're compromised all along the way. And then there are others who just blend things. They're blending Christianity with Islam. And one of the things I think about is I've heard people say, just drop the Trinity and you'd be more appealing to Muslims. And I'm saying, I think to myself, well, if we erase all the things that make Christianity, have we really gotten them to come over to Christianity? That's not how that works. If it's no longer Christianity that you've gotten them to embrace, then you didn't accomplish anything. So the bottom line for us is, though, the Bible doesn't allow us to mix and blend things. The Lord doesn't allow things to be mixed in his worship. Think of Nadab and Abihu. They brought unauthorized fire. God gave them some fire of his own. They died. Syncretism was always met with disapproval in the Bible. God always puts down this effort to blend the pure truth with error.
All right, well, I know these questions are a little more difficult than the others that I had, but again, they're things that I've wrestled with, and along with this question that I just asked, the Barna research also showed that there was a steady increase of Muslims in the United States over the last several years, and the top 3 states were New York come in at number 1, California was 2nd, and then the state of Illinois was 3rd. And I was recently at a pastor's conference in Illinois, and I'm doing these surveys with pastors, and I'm asking them, different questions. And a lot of them responded by saying that there's no Muslims where I live at. So I'm just not really interested in learning about Islam. There's no Muslims where I'm at. I'm just curious, I know it's a difficult question, but how would you respond to that?
In a place where there actually are? Right. I think I would challenge them to leave their little Christian bubble once in a while and go meet some people out on the streets, go to the mosque, meet some people there. There are very few places in the U.S. where there are no Muslims. And So I suppose, you know, if people are saying, well, there aren't any around me, and there really are, then that is probably an indication that they are only spending time with a very homogenous group of people, probably in a little Christian circle where everybody, you know, kind of thinks the same and has the exact same culture and things like that. So I'd probably invite, I mean, if I lived in one of these places, I would invite them to come with me, because that seems like it would have, to meet Muslims, it seems like it'd be more of an invitation than a kind of a rude challenge.
I would say two things. I'd say, have you spoken to your congregation about this? Do your congregation have Muslim workmates? Do they have Muslim friends? And they most likely do, particularly in those places. And so it's highly likely that they just don't know who their congregation are interacting with. And I would say this particularly with the youth, because this is something I'm passionate about. As I go around talking about this with pastors, they say to me, we don't have any Muslims in my area, and that's true, but their children are online and exposed. They spend half their life online, and online, where you live is irrelevant. And I have a dreadful task of helping Christian families in Australia whose children have converted to Islam through being online. They live in rural areas, everyone's white, you know, the pastor says, I don't need to know about Islam, and then he rings me up, and, you know, the mother rings me up in tears, and the pastor goes, you know, what do I do? And I'm going, well, you obviously don't know what the kids in your congregation are watching. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, maybe we need to run, I'm actually talking to a diocese about this at the moment, how they get it on the agenda, and I think this is part of it, to just realise that once the algorithm finds out your son or daughter is a Christian, they will inevitably see a testimony of a Christian who's become a Muslim, because that's all in the algorithm. And the algorithm's going to keep sending them different reels, different little videos. It'll say, did you like this one? Oh, let's try another one. Oh, you don't want to watch Billy Graham? Okay, let's try another one. Oh, do you like this person who became a Muslim? You know, they were a Christian, they become a Muslim. That's all within the algorithm's programming. So I would say that all Christian kids online will be seeing testimonies of Christians who have become Muslim.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I deal with a lot of youth, and I always tell them, you're the target, because they know you're not really, you know, biblical doctrine is not really part of the youth group. It really isn't in too many churches where the center point is not biblical doctrine. The center point is bands and just everything else. So they're the target for Muslims. They're the target for Mormons. They're the target for Jehovah's Witnesses and skeptical groups, because they know the youth, they're not learning anything, by and large, it seems. But I'm very concerned about the cities where Islam is growing and the churches do nothing. They just stay home. They don't want to know about Islam. That's very concerning. I'm concerned about the rural areas. My friend is a pastor of a church, a large church, one of the largest in Crosby, Texas. And I used to work with him in ministry, and he has 2 campuses. I guess when you call your church campus, then it's a giant church. I spoke there a few times, and it's a huge church. He told me a few months ago that the Muslims bought, I think he said like 50 acres or something. They're going to build a whole Islamic center. They're going to build a mosque. This is Crosby, Texas. It doesn't get more rural than that. In fact, where my friend lives in Crosby, about 4 blocks away is where George Foreman lives. And he says, so what should we do? And, you know, even if there's no Muslims, now he has a problem because no one knows what to do. I'm not sure if they even want to know what to do. But one thing about what I think, learning about Islam and other Unitarian groups, it sure increases your awareness of what the Trinity is and what it's not, because now you're forced to deal with arguments. I think every single church should have apologetic classes or behind the pulpit to teach the attacks on the Trinity and teach how to respond to these attacks, because frankly, most of the attacks by Unitarian groups, Islam, Jehovah's Witnesses, Christadelphians, all of them, you see are a huge and I think strong commonality. It's the same arguments. It's against the history of the church. It's against the Trinity was invented. I mean, attacks on the New Testament, attacks on the interpretation. It's all the same. Christian churches should have programs. It should start behind the pulpit. But I think these churches, it's not a matter of if, it's when, really. You're going to see a presence of Islam, like my friend in this giant, space in the middle of Crosby, Texas. Now they're building a mosque and a whole Islamic center. And there's going to be, they know how to proselytize. We don't. I mean, Christian church, they're not interested in going door to door. But the cults and false atheistic religions, they're interested, and it works for them. It works for them. That's why a lot of these groups are growing, because the church sits home and does nothing about it. So that's, my view in seeing this. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm trying to get him to do a conference in Crosby, Texas. But we'll see. Hopefully that will come about.
I do prison ministry, and part of what I do, what's involved in that, besides going out personally, preaching, teaching, and so forth, is I go to area churches, and I try and get people to become mentors to prisoners. So they pair off one-on-one. They talk to them about the Word, about Christ. They pray with them. They also work through issues with them, helping them prepare to get out and what they can do now and all this sort of thing. And one of the things that lead people to not want to do it or hesitate or what have you is just a general concern for their welfare or other things. They're afraid. They think, well, these guys are prisoners. It's not like it's unfounded or anything, but that's what keeps them from going in. They think, I'm going to be going into prison. This guy could be there for a violent crime or whatever it might be. I'm in danger. But here's the interesting thing. All the people I've ever gotten to be mentors, currently we have 100 plus at one prison like 5 minutes from my house. I've never once heard a single mentor turn around and say they were sorry for what they did, like going in. I don't know any of them who have ever left there without telling me something like this. It's just a variation of this, where they'll say things like, I went in thinking that I would be a blessing to a prisoner, but I can't help but feel like I'm the one who's been blessed. I know that's the experience of almost any Christian who's had an opportunity to witness to somebody. After they've witnessed to somebody, they're like on this high, like this was the greatest thing ever. I got to talk to this person about Jesus, and they were worried to get in the conversation. I've gone out witnessing countless times, and it usually takes me a few minutes to get worked up into it. Like how do I stop this person from whatever they were doing? They're going along their merry way, and I'm about to interrupt it, and talk about doom and gloom and their sin or whatever, and they're potentially not going to be happy with me. So I have to psych myself up again all over each time I do this, and say, no, you're telling them what they need to know, and this person may well receive it, and it may well bear fruit later, and so forth. But I think it's the same thing here. I think what's behind some of this, the pastor saying, oh, there's no more Muslims in my area when there really are, is they don't want to know that there are Muslims in their area. They're hoping there's no Muslims in their area. They're not trying to think about Muslims being in their area. And if there are Muslims in their area, then they're not enough to be a relevant factor, or whatever it may be. And what's behind some of this, for many of them, is I don't think I'll be able to witness to them or what have you. But that's why they need to study and why they need to be part of these things and so forth. And most of what I learned early on, in fact, the major first 10 years, I learned from doing it. I did make mistakes, and I did have Muslims who stumped me and so forth. But the Lord used it all along the way. One thing I remember, I always used to hear Muslims saying things like, we love Jesus, we honor Jesus. And, it doesn't take somebody who's a sophisticated theologian or anything like that to just think that through and say, wait a minute. You know, if I go, I think I was with George once, we were at a mosque, and this guy gave the whole spiel. They do this all the time. The guy said, we honor Jesus, we love Jesus more than you do. And I think, oh, okay. And I said, imagine if you went to a big corporation. Let's say you got a job there, you got an entry-level job there. And every time you saw the CEO of the company, you talked to him like he was the janitor. You know, go grab the mop bucket for me, go do this, whatever. How long do you think you'd work there? I mean, maybe the CEO would think it's funny at first, I don't know, but I think you see where this is going. You can say that you honor or love somebody with, you know, in your mind because you think you're treating them according to the level that they're on. But if that's not the level they're on, and you're supposed to be treating them like they're up here, well, then it's not love, and it's not respect, and so forth. It doesn't take anybody profound to see something like that. And sometimes, you know, I learn these illustrations from people that are far more practical than I am, because I don't always think very practically. But my point is just to say that there are a lot of people who think they can't be effective, and I always think, no, you've got it all wrong. The Lord, you know, you don't need to be sophisticated, you don't need to be worried. One last thing I think of all the time when I'm witnessing is it doesn't matter. I'll walk into a crowd of 10 people, 20 people, 30 people. I always think, yeah, there's definitely things are stacked in one direction. Somebody, you know, is, what do you call that when there's 1 against 30? The odds are stacked, you know. But I'm never thinking it's the 30 who have everything on their side. I'm always thinking, I'm going to this conversation in the name of God, and that God holds your heart in his hand and can, you know, snap his fingers and you cease to exist. So I always go into the conversation thinking, you're outnumbered, and that has a world of difference to it. And I just think, you know, people getting these sorts of things in their mind and being willing to talk about Christ and not thinking that they're not capable of doing it. You certainly are. And don't be afraid. You'll never leave these conversations thinking at the end of the day you shouldn't have gotten into a witnessing encounter with them.
Excellent. That was a good word. All right. All across America, students are protesting for Hamas, calling for an end to occupation. What say ye?
Learn history, open the Quran. Wow. Yeah, this breaks my heart because I hear this so often, so often, and it's usually mothers calling me saying their children of all different ages, from young to 40 years old, are pro-Hamas and condemning the Jews and carrying signs saying things like "queers for Hamas," which if they put you with Hamas, they would kill you right away. So it's just nonsensical. I think that there's been a lot of indoctrination through social media and through the public education system. I think it's really important that parents be aware of what their children are being exposed to. Even if they go to a Christian school, kids tend to be more influenced by the little bundles of depravity that they go to school with than by the single teacher in a lot of cases. And so it's so important to know who they're with and what they're learning, and to have an open conversation so that they know they can come to you with anything, and that those are that all doubts, all questions, all objections are on the table to be discussed. And yes, that means a lot more work for the parents than just driving them to soccer practice and back, but it is absolutely worth it when these parents call me and say, well, I just thought that by sending them to the Christian school, that was enough. Or I thought by putting them in youth group, that was all they needed. And now I find out that they are, they've become Muslims, or that they are pro-Hamas, that they have no idea. They're making claims about Israel that are things that have been done by Hamas. Like the other day, someone called me and said she and her daughter had, her adult daughter had just had an argument, and her adult daughter was saying that Israel beheads children, Israel puts children in ovens and burns them to death, Israel goes into Palestine and rapes women randomly, and things like this. And they and their primary sources of news are TikTok and Instagram and their friends. And so I mean, this is it. The claims are entirely contrary to the facts, but we need to know the facts. We need to know where to point people to their sources. So several people asked me, well, what's a neutral source that I can give to my my daughter or my son that they might read it, because they're not going to read a conservative source. But if we're training them up and they're seeing what's in the Quran, they are learning what's in the Hadith, the primary sources, and they're learning the reasons for the hope that they have in Jesus, then and thinking through all kinds of issues, worldview, Christian worldview, economics, reality as we know it, policy and the impact of policies, and they have a Christian worldview, then when this false information comes at them, they're not going to be as susceptible. And so I'm a huge advocate of saying we need to start from the time they're born and have good conversations and equip them, because frankly, I can give you a few thoughts of what to send your 32-year-old daughter, but to be honest, at this point, I pray, and not. I don't say that as like it's hopeless, but in a lot of ways, your opportunity has passed. And so, if you still have that opportunity with grandchildren or with your children, with neighbor children, I get text messages every day from parents in my neighborhood saying, "Can my son, my daughter, walk with you and your dog when you go for a walk today?" Because they know that we have these kinds of conversations in every single walk. So get involved with the lives of those who are around you and equip them before they are the 30 or the 40 or the 50-year-old standing out with a sign saying, "Queers for Hamas."
I don't want to try to add to that. I want to take it on a slightly different track. And what I've been saying to people is you've got the Palestinians and the Jews who really hate each other. And what do you do when there's groups of people who really, really hate each other? What do? Right? What's the way forward there? Who gives us teaching that could possibly give us a way forward here? And in the end, I want to say it's only Jesus and love your enemy that is the only solution here, because the solution for either side in this situation, like they just hate each other and want to wipe each other out. And you can look at, say, well, this is what the Quran says they're meant to be in charge. The Jews feel that they need to be there. What's the way forward? And in the end, I feel it's got to be following the ways of Jesus is the only way forward there. So,
there's not much to add, but we just have to understand God is sovereign, and prayers are effectual. And unfortunately, people are not swayed by factual data. They're swayed by their friends, and as Laura pointed out, TikTok. I mean, that's where they get the brunt of their information, and they don't care if we say it's disinformation, which it is. But you'll never win over an emotional argument because it's so high emotional. Don't confuse me with the facts kind of thing. All we can do is pray to the Lord, the sovereign God, to open their heart, open their eyes, open their brain. That's all we can do, because you'll never win the argument.